Fog sits low over the Hemsley orchard, clinging to the twisted branches like something that refuses to let go, and beneath the damp hush of morning the land smells sweeter than it should, like fruit left to rot in the dark. Outsiders always called the place blessed, said no Appalachian frost could ever truly wound those trees, but the people who lived nearby understood better. Blessings don't come free in the mountains, and anything that keeps growing when the rest of the world starves has already bargained too deeply with whatever listens beneath the soil. The Hemsley sisters lived alone on that sprawling property, their windows always dark, their footsteps soft and measured, as though they were afraid to disturb something sleeping below them. They rarely spoke to anyone, except the men who passed through town, men who came chasing work, rumors of easy money harvesting, or just the curious urge to see their fabled orchard up close. No one ever paid attention to that quiet gate swallowing strangers, not at first. But people remembered the orchard long after the men vanished, remembered the way the trees bowed, heavy with fruit, as though weighed down by secrets instead of apples, and how the cellar beneath the house never opened even once in 31 long disappearances, yet somehow was always listening. When the Hemsley sisters inherited the orchard and the sprawling house that crouched at its center, it did not feel like a gift so much as a sentence, an obligation sealed generations ago that had simply arrived for them at last. The deed was handed to them quietly after their grandmother's death, along with a ring of iron keys and a final instruction whispered by a lawyer who looked as though he wanted no part in repeating it. They were never to open the cellar door beneath the house, not for storm, not for repair, not for curiosity, not for prayer. The warning sounded old, rehearsed, as if it had been spoken every time the property changed hands, and yet it carried a trembling urgency that suggested even those who didn't believe still feared the consequences of breaking it. The house itself bore the weight of that rule. The floors creaked as though they guarded secrets, the walls held their breath, and the cellar door sat in the hallway like an eye that refused to blink. Outside, the orchard stretched in neat, obedient lines, but nothing about it felt ordinary. The earth there seemed too rich, the air too heavy with sweetness, and the trees leaned a little toward the house, as if listening for whatever was being kept below. The sisters, young enough to still feel the ache of inheritance and old enough to understand that family instructions carry teeth, tried to treat the warning as superstition, yet every night the keys clinked like chains on the bedside table, reminding them there was a boundary they must not cross, a promise they did not make but were still bound to keep. Locals who remembered the grandmother spoke of her as a woman who rarely smiled and never slept deeply, pacing the property at dawn, murmuring to the soil as if bargaining with it, and the sisters could not shake the sense that they had inherited not only land but a conversation already in progress, one they were expected to answer correctly. Even the silence of the place felt conditional, like a favor that could be withdrawn the moment the wrong door was opened. Nights grew longer in that house, and the cellar remained a presence more than a room, a waiting mouth beneath their feet that made every step feel like a question. The inheritance never felt quiet. Ever. In the years that followed the inheritance, the orchard became a quiet crossroads for strangers, a place where men arrived with dust on their boots and hopeful hunger in their voices, drawn by rumors that there was always work available on Hemsley soil and that the pay was strangely generous for a place so remote. They came from neighboring Appalachian towns at first, then farther away, men who had burned through their luck elsewhere and thought perhaps fortune could be coaxed from an apple tree. They stepped through the gate with easy confidence, greeted politely by the sisters, who spoke softly and never offered more than necessary, and for a while it was easy to believe that the orchard truly was nothing more than thriving land tended by quiet women. But time began to bruise the illusion. One by one, those men stopped returning home. Wives waited for telegrams that never came, families searched along the mountain roads, sheriffs shrugged at the lack of tracks or signs of struggle, and the list of missing names began to whisper itself through every town within reach of the valley. No one could draw a straight line to the Hemsley property without sounding like they were swallowing superstition, yet everyone knew the orchard was always the last thing mentioned in conversation before someone disappeared. Folks began to notice how the air around the orchard seemed to thicken when dusk fell, how travelers avoided camping near it, how even birds seemed to hesitate above those heavy blooming trees. At first, the sisters were approached kindly, asked if they had seen anyone, if perhaps men had simply moved on without word, but over time the questions soured, turning sharper, quieter, more suspicious. Still, there were no footprints leading away, no bodies dragged into the woods, nothing that could be held up as proof, only the strange insistence of absence and the orchard that kept flourishing as though it needed those empty names the way its roots needed rain. 31 men in all, erased without drama, without noise, as if swallowed whole not by violence but by the land itself, leaving behind only anxious whispers, widowed stares, and the heavy knowledge that the road to the Hemsley orchard was one many men travelled into but somehow never returned from, and the trees just kept bowing with fruit while the cellar stayed shut and everyone pretended not to hear what the ground might be keeping quiet behind that sweetness. People began to notice that the orchard did not obey the same rules as the rest of the mountain, that while neighbouring farms fought frostbite and blight and summers that dried the soil to bone, the Hemsley trees stood lush and indulgent, their branches bending low with fruit that seemed almost ashamed of how plentiful it was. Apples ripened faster there, sweeter, thicker in flesh, as though something beneath the ground fed them more than water and sunlight ever could, and people whispered that the orchard didn't just grow, it thrived with a hunger that didn't belong to plants. Seasons that should have punished the land barely brushed it, storms that tore roofs off nearby barns left its leaves untouched, and every year it became harder to pretend that this was luck or skilled tending instead of something older and more selective choosing to bless only this patch of earth. The most unsettling part wasn't the beauty of it, but the timing, because the trees seemed to grow more robust each time another man went missing, as if absence itself had weight that pressed into the soil and fed the roots. Housewives who once admired the orchard began to avert their eyes when passing it, muttering that no tree should bloom that happily while grief walked the roads around it. Hunters refused to cut through that land no matter how convenient the route, claiming the air tasted wrong there, too sweet, like meat left in sugar. Children dared each other to pluck fruit and never finished their bites, spitting the taste out with a shudder they couldn't name. Every superstition, every mountain tale about bargains with the land, began pointing toward the sisters' property, even if no one dared accuse them outright. The orchard was becoming more than a field of trees. It was turning into a presence that breathed quietly, a witness that watched anyone who crossed its bounds, a living testament to the idea that something was being given to it and something was being received in return. People spoke in kitchen corners and church pews, saying the orchard was being fed in ways they didn't want to understand, that it had learned to bloom on loss, that its roots had wrapped around secrets and would never loosen unless someone was willing to face what was buried beneath that sweetness. Rumors thickened into something closer to fear when a drifter came through town, the kind of man no one usually listens to, rough-bearded and road-tired, but there was something in his eyes that made people lean closer when he spoke about what he'd seen near the Hemsley orchard. He said he'd taken shelter by the house at dusk, meaning only to rest and maybe charm a bit of food from the sisters, but instead found himself staring at the cellar door from the shadows of the porch as the evening settled heavy around him. He swore that as the last light slipped out of the valley, something shifted behind that wood, not like rats or pipes or normal house sounds, but like breath pressed too close to a barrier, like hands dragging slowly along the inside of the door. Then, he said, faces appeared in that dark seam where the door met its frame, pale shapes, impossibly thin and stretched, not like the living but not yet like the dead, watching with a hunger that didn't belong to anything human. He heard murmuring too, not quite voices, more like sound scraped across stone, and he ran, tripping over roots and branches, not daring to look back, convinced that if he did one of those faces might slip out with him. People laughed at him because it was easier than believing him, but they noticed how his hands shook when he told it, how he couldn't bring himself to go anywhere near that side of town again. He kept trying to warn anyone who would listen, saying the cellar wasn't keeping people out, it was keeping something in, saying the orchard wasn't blessed, it was being fed, and then, just like the rest, he vanished. One morning his bed at the cheap boarding house was empty, his belongings still folded at the foot, as if he had simply stepped outside and dissolved into the air. After that, even the skeptics felt a cold hesitation settle in their chests whenever they passed the orchard gate, because now the disappearances weren't just absence, they had a shape to them, a whispered face in the dark. Something pressed against a locked door that was never meant to open yet somehow kept calling for someone foolish enough to listen. The orchard began speaking in ways no one could ignore when the trees themselves started bearing marks that didn't belong to weather, tools, or careless hands, but to something intimate and terrified. It was first noticed by a boy who sneaked onto the property for a dare, returning white-faced and breathless, insisting that the trees were carved with names that shouldn't be there. When men from town finally went to see for themselves, they found initials etched into the bark, not neat or deliberate, but jagged and desperate, like letters cut in panic, lines trembling, words forced into living wood as if written at the last moment by hands that were not free. Some initials matched the missing men, familiar to wives, sisters, mothers who had been waiting years for even a scrap of proof that those men had existed somewhere beyond memory, and the realization hollowed their chests. The bark around some carvings looked swollen, as if the trees had tried to heal but could not quite swallow the names, leaving them raw and permanent, like scars the orchard refused to let fade. More unsettling was how fresh some of the marks looked despite years having passed, as though the trees received new writing from hands no one ever saw, as though something still living beneath the soil kept scratching its identity upward, begging not to be forgotten. At night, people swore the trees creaked differently, like wood straining under whispered confessions, and a few claimed that if you stood very still between the rows, the wind didn't move randomly there, it threaded itself around the trunks like a voice looking for a listener. Farmers from surrounding lands stopped walking near the orchard boundary altogether because the moment they stepped too close they felt watched not by the sisters, not even by the house, but by the trees themselves, which seemed to lean inward in a faint, unnatural curve, as if guarding something or gathering closer to breathe in secrets. Those who had lost loved ones began drifting there in grief, hoping for a sign, and more than one woman collapsed when she found letters carved that mirrored a necklace, a handwriting style, a mark only someone beloved would know. The orchard had become an unwilling ledger of vanished lives, each trunk a witness bearing silent testimony, every trembling letter proof that whatever happened to those men did not erase them cleanly but trapped their fear somewhere between bark and bone and earth, held in place by roots that refused to let go, as if the orchard itself could not forget what it had been asked to consume and would not let anyone else forget either. Suspicion finally hardened into action when a young sheriff, newly appointed and still stubborn enough to believe order could be wrestled from mountain superstition, decided that someone had to stop whispering and start looking, and he began his investigation quietly, without public announcements or official paperwork, as if afraid that saying it out loud might wake whatever the town was trying not to acknowledge. He sifted through old ledgers, bus tickets, employment notes, and letters that had stopped mid-promise, slowly sketching a map of absence that kept circling back to the same patch of land. Every missing man, no matter how different their lives had been, no matter how far they'd traveled or how random their paths seemed, had at some point in their final days come near the Hemsley orchard, either to ask for work, to deliver supplies, to fix a fence, to drink water under the shade of its trees, or simply to stare too long at the impossible abundance growing there. The pattern wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it was careful and devastating, a quiet thread woven invisibly through years of vanishing, and once he saw it, he couldn't unsee it. He started visiting the property under the pretense of routine patrols, noting that the sisters were always polite but never relaxed, always watchful, answering questions with the precision of people who had rehearsed truths to keep deeper truths from slipping free. The sheriff found receipts for tools never used, seasonal employment forms filled out but never returned, and occasional letters written by men mentioning the orchard as their last known destination before the line of ink simply stopped forever. He spoke to the older townsfolk who remembered the grandmother, and their voices trembled when they told him that the orchard had always taken more than it gave, and that the cellar had always been locked for a reason no one liked to say aloud. The further he dug, the more it felt like he was not uncovering a crime but brushing against the edge of a pact, something woven through bloodlines and soil, something that made rational explanations feel small and brittle against the heavy hush of that land, and every new detail bound him tighter to the realization that the Hemsley property was not only connected to the disappearances, it was the quiet center of them, the last place men breathed freely before the world lost their names, and the orchard grew sweeter again. The sheriff eventually reached a point where questions were no longer enough, and one storm-heavy evening he crossed the boundary between suspicion and trespass, slipping into the Hemsley house while the sisters were gone, telling himself it was duty though it felt more like compulsion. Inside, the air felt older than the house, thick with dust and a faint sweetness that clung to the back of his throat, and the rooms were strangely neat, every object arranged with a careful precision that suggested less domesticity and more ritual. He followed the faint hum of something mechanical to a small back room and found a collection of worn phonograph records, each labeled in the grandmother's handwriting, titles written like prayers instead of songs. When he played one, the room filled with slow, mournful hymns, voices layered in a way that didn't sound like worship so much as pleading, and beneath the music there was a faint rhythmic knocking, as if something distant was answering. He searched further and found notebooks stacked beneath a loose floorboard, their pages filled with brittle ink and instructions that didn't read like superstition but like necessity, rules and recitations, warnings written in a hand that shook harder the further the pages went, detailing how the cellar must remain sealed, how the house must be tended like a boundary rather than a home, how the orchard thrived only so long as the door below remained locked and the rituals were followed without fail. The most unsettling lines made no effort to hide that whatever was beneath the cellar had not always been there by accident. It had been bargained with, coaxed, bound, promised something in exchange for protection and prosperity, and the sealing of that door was less prison than containment, less fear of what might come in and more terror of what might get out. The sheriff felt the weight of those words settle in his bones, felt the realization that the cellar wasn't a secret the family had hidden out of shame, it was a wall they had been holding up for generations, and every scratched hymn, every recorded chant, every trembling instruction existed because there had already been a time when the door had opened and the land had learned what it meant to hunger in ways humans could barely comprehend, leaving him standing there with the terrible understanding that the danger wasn't in the silence but in what might answer if that silence was broken. Nights inside the Hemsley house began changing in ways that no explanation could politely ignore, because what had once been ordinary quiet turned into something watchful and breathing, and the sisters, who had spent their lives treating the cellar like an unspoken boundary, suddenly found themselves listening for it the way one listens to thunder on the horizon. At first it was small, a faint thrum beneath the floorboards like pipes settling or the shifting of old wood, the kind of sound a house makes when it's trying to remind you it's survived storms before. But then the noise developed in tension. It came at certain hours, just when the lamps were being turned down, when the sisters were most vulnerable to memory and fear, a scraping steady and deliberate, dragging across the underside of their lives as if something down there had learned their rhythms and wanted them to know it was learning. There were nights when the sound became too close, tapping beneath their feet like knuckles knocking for attention, and the older sister would press her palm to the boards and swear she felt warmth pulsing back, something alive responding to the contact as though grateful to be acknowledged. Sleep thinned into something fragile and nervous. They started keeping the phonograph hymns playing longer, their grandmother's voice and those layered chants trembling through the house like a fragile barrier stitched from sound rather than faith. Sometimes the noise didn't come from directly beneath the cellar at all but from further along the hall, scratching under the parlor or brushing under the kitchen tiles, as though whatever had been contained was stretching, testing, learning the limits of the house that held it. The sisters began to speak to each other in whispers again, like they had when they were younger and afraid of storms, only now the storm was under their feet, and it wasn't whether that frightened them but the possibility that the generations of ritual were weakening, that the pact was shifting, that the sealed door was no longer enough. They moved lighter across the floors, terrified that even a misplaced footstep might sound like invitation, and every night they lay awake listening, waiting to see if the sounds would fade like a bad dream or form words one day, knocking in a rhythm too close to language, too close to being answered. The moment came when the cellar could no longer be ignored, when whispers and scratches and the strange weight of the orchard pressed so insistently that the sisters and the sheriff both understood that opening the door was no longer a choice but an inevitability. The lock yielded with a protest that sounded like a groan of the house itself, and the smell that rose was ancient and fertile, damp with earth and something far darker, a musk that carried the memory of fear, of absence, of lives that had lingered in the shadows too long. Inside, the air was thick and still, moving only when the sheriff dared to step forward, and the light from his lantern revealed shapes that had grown strangely familiar over decades of whispered stories, the pale, twisted forms of 31 men, trapped in a space that seemed smaller than the number of bodies it contained, their eyes hollow but aware, their hands stretched toward the light as though it could undo the years of waiting. The walls themselves were lined with roots that had crept through cracks in the stone, intertwining with the captives, feeding, binding, as though the orchard's hunger had reached beneath the house to claim what it needed most. The sisters trembled, not in fear for themselves but for what had been wrought through their family line, the revelation that every harvest, every miraculous season of abundance, had been paid for with lives trapped in soil and shadow, and that the orchard itself was a ledger of debts, now claiming its balance. The men, though alive in some sense, were not fully human anymore, the light reflected from their eyes like water pooling over stone, and their voices, when they came, were echoes of memory rather than speech, muttering names and years and a strange gratitude for release mingled with despair. The sheriff's hands shook as he tried to comprehend the scale of what had been hidden beneath the house, the enormity of a secret that had been both carefully maintained and monstrously lived, a secret that the Hemsley sisters had nurtured with ritual, discipline, and fear. Outside, the orchard seemed to shiver, branches bending as though aware that the balance had shifted, that the silence it had maintained for decades was broken. In that moment, the truth was unmistakable. The orchard had never been merely blessed, the cellar had never been merely locked, and the Hemsley property was both cradle and prison, source and sacrifice, an impossible testament to the price exacted when the living bargain with what sleeps beneath the soil. The confrontation beneath the orchard came with a darkness so complete it seemed to press against the very bones of those who descended into the cellar, a cold, living weight that smelled of earth and decay and something older than memory. The sisters led the way reluctantly, their hands trembling on the rungs of the ladder that descended into shadow, while the sheriff followed, lanterns swinging and casting long, quivering beams that barely penetrated the gloom. Every step echoed as though the house itself were speaking, groaning and whispering warnings, and with each footfall, the truth became more impossible to ignore. The 31 men were there, not fully alive, not fully dead, their bodies twisted in ways that suggested generations of slow change, their eyes luminous and aware, their whispers filling the stone space with fragments of names, dates, and fearful pleas. The air seemed to pulse with intent, the roots from the orchard above having breached the stone and soil, intertwining with the captives and feeding on the life that had been brought into this secret chamber for decades. The sheriff realized that the orchard's unnatural growth and the house's meticulous upkeep had been sustained by these men, that every bloom, every thickening branch, every unusually sweet apple had been bought at a price that stretched beyond morality, beyond comprehension. The sisters' faces were pale, etched with the knowledge of what had been demanded, what they had been forced to perpetuate, and they murmured prayers that sounded more like bargaining than devotion, attempting to soothe something that had been fed on fear and obedience for too long. The captives shifted, their motions slow but deliberate, reaching toward the living in ways that suggested recognition but also a hunger born of centuries of confinement, a need for acknowledgement that went far beyond relief. In that underground room, the boundary between life and something else thinned dangerously, and the sheriff understood that the Hemsley bloodline had maintained its prosperity by negotiating with the soil itself, by offering it what it craved, and now, finally, the earth demanded reckoning. The roots throbbed, the air vibrated, and every sound felt like it carried judgment, as though the orchard above were watching, waiting, and feeding simultaneously, testing the living for what they were willing to sacrifice or endure to close the balance once and for all. In the cellar, the past and present collided, and no one could step forward without acknowledging that the orchard's blessings had never been free, that the silence above had been bought with lives beneath, and that now the land, patient and insatiable, expected its due in full, and the living were at last forced to confront the depth of what the Hemsley family had promised to the soil and what the soil would take in return.